What if the quiet man working next to you wasn't just quiet, but a dangerous secret hiding in plain sight? The year is 1957, a normal Tuesday, a Tuesday just like 1,000 others in this humming fortress of American industry. But for Elsie, this day wouldn't fade into the dull background of memory. This day would burn itself into her soul, because on this very afternoon, just feet away from her, a man was about to vanish. Not just disappear, but evaporate. And she knew why. She knew exactly who he was. She knew the lies, the intricate deceptions woven into his everyday routine. And she knew what he was truly capable of. What she didn't know yet was the real, bone-chilling price she'd pay for knowing. A price that would rewrite her life, her understanding of her country, and the very fabric of her own courage. This isn't just a story about a factory worker. This is a story about a woman who looked closer, listened harder, and found a ghost in the machine of American innocence. A ghost with very real, very dangerous Soviet ties. But before we dive deeper, if you're fascinated by the hidden battles of Cold War, also if you love your family, then subscribe, like, and comment. What's your favorite part and character? It means a lot to us. We appreciate your support. The smell of hot metal and machine oil was Elsie's perfume. It clung to her clothes, her hair, even her skin, a constant reminder of the life she'd built. Day in, day out, for the last 12 years, Elsie Mae Peterson had stood on this very spot, tightening bolts, checking gauges, ensuring the flow of whatever critical component her section of the massive Ohio plant was churning out that week. It was honest work, hard work, American work, and she was damn proud of it. Elsie wasn't a dreamer. She was a doer. Practical, grounded, with a keen eye for detail honed by years of spotting a faulty weld or a loose connection before it became a costly problem. She was in her late 30s, a widow since the war claimed her husband in some muddy field in France, leaving her with a small pension and a fierce independence. Life had taught Elsie to trust her instincts, to read between the lines, and to notice things others simply overlooked. This wasn't a superpower. It was survival. The factory hummed with purpose. Its rhythmic clang and whir were the soundtrack to America's booming post-war economy. Cars, appliances, defense contracts, this plant contributed to it all. Patriotism wasn't just a word you heard on the radio. It was etched into the sweat and toil of every worker on that floor. You felt it in the lunchroom, in the camaraderie, in the shared belief that what they were doing here together was important. They were building the future. They were protecting their way of life. Then 6 months ago he arrived, Nikolai Sokolov, or at least that's what his papers said. He was assigned to the line right next to Elsie's, a transfer from a plant in Detroit, supposedly. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold all the quiet of a winter night. He moved with a strange, almost unsettling grace for a man working a heavy machinery line. Every movement was precise, economical, never a wasted gesture. He spoke little. When he did, his English was perfect, almost too perfect, with only the faintest whisper of an accent that Elsie couldn't quite place. It wasn't German. It wasn't French. It was something else. At first, Elsie didn't think much of it. Newcomers were always a bit stiff. Some were shy. Sokolov was just quiet, alarmingly quiet. He never joined the lunchtime banter, never talked about the ball game or his weekend, never complained about the foreman or the temperature. He simply worked, and he worked flawlessly. Too flawlessly, maybe. Elsie, like everyone else, valued efficiency, but Sokolov's perfection felt clinical, almost unnatural, like a machine designed to mimic a man. The other workers, mostly men, found him odd but largely harmless. A real quiet type, that Sokolov, they'd say, shrugging, keeps to himself. Some joked he was a robot. Others called him the monk because of his ascetic demeanor. Elsie heard these comments, but they didn't ease her growing unease. In fact, they amplified it. Because while everyone else saw quiet, Elsie saw absence. Absence of a past. Absence of a personality. Absence of any real human connection. He was a blank slate, and that, to Elsie, was a red flag flapping violently in a windless room. Everyone had a story, a family, a preference, a flaw. Sokolov had none that he shared. He was a puzzle with no discernible pieces. One particularly sweltering afternoon, the air thick with humidity and the smell of hot metal, a conveyor belt jammed. It was a minor incident, easily fixed, but it caused a ripple of frantic energy through their section. Tools clattered, men shouted instructions, sweat streamed down faces. Amidst the chaos, Elsie noticed Sokolov. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even watching the drama unfold with curiosity like everyone else. He was just observing. His gaze was fixed not on the jammed belt, but on the control panel, his eyes scanning the gauges, taking in the sequence of the workers' responses. There was no emotion on his face, just pure, cold calculation. It was a tiny detail, but it lodged in Elsie's mind like a splinter. Why wasn't he participating? Why was he studying the system of the breakdown, not the breakdown itself? It felt like he was gathering data. Later that week in the noisy lunchroom, Elsie watched him eat his packed lunch, always the same: a hard-boiled egg, a piece of dry bread, an apple. He ate slowly, deliberately, not looking up, oblivious to the boisterous conversation around him. A new guy, fresh from military service, was telling a joke, loud and crude, and the whole table erupted in laughter. Elsie glanced at Sokolov. Not a flicker, no smile, no grimace, no acknowledgement. It was as if he was deaf to human joy. You'd think he'd at least crack a smile, Elsie mumbled to her friend Betty, who sat across from her, enthusiastically devouring a tuna sandwich. Betty just shrugged. Some folks just ain't got a funny bone, Elsie, or maybe he just doesn't like tuna. She winked. Elsie forced a small smile, but her gaze drifted back to Sokolov. It wasn't about the joke. It was about the complete and utter lack of human reaction. It wasn't shyness. It was something deeper, something disconnected. The real shift in Elsie's perception came during a routine fire drill. The piercing siren blared, startling everyone. Confusion, then orderly evacuation. As they all streamed out into the assembly yard, Elsie found herself near Sokolov. In the commotion, a young apprentice tripped, sending a stack of metal plates clattering to the ground. Everyone froze, looking at the boy, who was mortified. Elsie saw Sokolov's eyes flick to the apprentice, then immediately to the spilled plates, then to the fire exit sign, and finally to the security guard who was barking instructions. It was a microsecond assessment, a threat matrix, not an empathetic glance, not a concern for the fallen boy, just data input. The Cold War wasn't just on the evening news, it was in the air. Like the metallic tang of the factory floor, you could smell it, taste it. McCarthyism might have faded a bit, but the fear of communism, of spies, of saboteurs, still seeped into every crack of American life. News anchors spoke in hushed tones about Soviet aggression. School children practiced duck and cover drills under their desks. Families talked about backyard bomb shelters. It was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, a background noise everyone had learned to live with. But for Elsie, that hum was starting to sound a lot like a specific chilling frequency. It was starting to sound like Nikolai Sokolov. After the fire drill incident, Elsie couldn't unsee him. He became a focal point, a distorted mirror reflecting her growing paranoia. Every small detail, once dismissed as an eccentricity, now screamed anomaly. His lunch, always the same, seemed less like habit and more like discipline. His perfectly pristine overalls, even at the end of a gritty shift, weren't just clean, they were immaculate. How did he manage that? Was it a conscious effort? An obsession with blending in by being too clean? She started watching him, discreetly at first. A glance over her shoulder, a peek from behind a stack of parts. She noticed his hands. They were strong, calloused from the factory work, but there was a certain delicacy to his movements, precise, nimble, not the usual blunt force of a factory hand. He handled small tools with an almost surgical finesse. This detail gnawed at her. What kind of training resulted in that? The factory had a small library, mostly manuals and technical journals, but also some popular magazines. Elsie, on a break, saw Sokolov there one day. He wasn't reading a magazine. He was studying a large, complex blueprint. It was a schematic for a new kind of hydraulic system that their plant was developing for a military contractor. Elsie knew this because she'd seen the project manager poring over similar plans. Sokolov wasn't just glancing at it. He was tracing lines with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't his section. It wasn't even close to his section. What was he doing? When he finally looked up, his eyes met Elsie's across the dim room. For a split second, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, not anger, not surprise, but a quick, assessing spark. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual impassive mask. He slowly folded the blueprint neatly, precisely, and placed it back on the shelf. He didn't say anything, just walked away. Elsie's heart pounded. He knew she saw him, he knew. And the way he just put it back without a word, without a hint of explanation, was more unsettling than if he'd tried to hide it. It was an open secret, a challenge. She tried to voice her concerns. Tentatively, she brought it up with Betty, her closest friend at the plant. "You know Sokolov." Elsie began, trying to sound casual. Betty sighed dramatically. "Oh, the monk. Yeah, quietest man I ever met. He barely grunts good morning." "Don't you think it's strange?" Elsie pressed. "He never talks about anything. He's always watching things, not people. And I saw him looking at those classified blueprints today." Betty laughed, a loud, dismissive sound that drew a few glances. "Elsie, honey, everyone looks at those blueprints. Half the men here are trying to figure out how to build their own contraption in the garage. And as for him being quiet, some folks just ain't social butterflies. You're reading too much into it." She took a bite of her sandwich. "All this Red Scare stuff has got you jumpy, that's all." Betty's words stung. Elsie knew she sounded paranoid, even to herself. How could she explain the cumulative effect of 1,000 tiny, unsettling details? The subtle shift in his accent when he was tired and let his guard down for a moment, revealing a harsher, unfamiliar cadence. The way he seemed to know things about the plant's operations that weren't common knowledge, like the exact timing of certain material deliveries or the shift patterns of the night crew. She tried again with George, one of the older, more respected foremen. He was a veteran of 2 wars, a man who saw things clearly. "George, have you noticed anything unusual about Sokolov?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. George paused, wiping grease from his brow with a rag. "Sokolov, good worker, never late, never complains, keeps to himself, but that's his business. Why, Elsie, you got a problem with him?" His tone was sharp, implying a complaint about a productive worker was a waste of his time. "It's just, he's too perfect, and he's always observing, and I saw him with those blueprints for the new project, the confidential ones." George scoffed. "Confidential, yes, but not top secret, Elsie. Half the floor knows generally what's on M, and observant, that's what a good worker is. You're getting yourself wound up. We got a good thing going here. Don't go stirring up trouble where there ain't any." He turned back to his work, clearly dismissing her. Elsie felt a profound sense of isolation. No one believed her. No one even seemed to see what she saw. They saw a quiet, efficient worker. She saw a meticulously crafted deception. The Cold War fear that permeated society was a general, amorphous anxiety about them, the Soviets, out there. It wasn't meant for the man standing right next to you on the assembly line, looking just like everyone else. People were quick to dismiss such specific, localized suspicions as hysteria. But the seed of doubt, now watered by dismissal, had blossomed into a thorny bush of conviction in Elsie's mind. She knew. She didn't have proof that would convince George or Betty, but her gut, honed by decades of living in a world that didn't always play fair, screamed at her. Sokolov wasn't just strange. He was dangerous. And the plant they were so proud of, this symbol of American strength, was precisely the kind of place a foreign enemy would want to infiltrate. One evening after her shift, as Elsie was walking to the bus stop, she saw Sokolov again. He was in a dimly lit alleyway behind the plant, a place rarely used by anyone. He wasn't alone. He was talking to another man, a man Elsie didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit despite the warmth of the evening. They weren't talking openly. Their heads were close, their voices a low murmur, almost conspiratorial. Sokolov handed the man a small, dark package. The exchange was quick, almost furtive. Then they separated, melting into the shadows in opposite directions. Elsie froze, hidden behind a dumpster, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elsie walked home that evening in a daze, the factory sounds replaced by the thunder of her own pulse. The image of Sokolov and the suited man exchanging that dark package replayed in her mind, a grainy, sinister film. It was no longer a question of if he was involved in something shady. It was what and how. And more importantly, what did she do now? Her small, neat house, usually a sanctuary of calm, suddenly felt exposed, fragile. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the street lamp outside seemed to hold a new, chilling significance. The world had shifted. The comfortable normalcy she'd known her whole life was now tinged with a dangerous, unseen threat. A Soviet spy. Here. In their town. In their factory. It felt like a plot from a cheap thriller novel, but it was horrifyingly real. She couldn't tell Betty. Betty would just laugh. George would dismiss her. Her neighbors, good God, they'd think she'd lost her mind. The specter of Cold War hysteria, the very thing people used to dismiss her concerns, would now be used against her. She'd be branded a crackpot, a troublemaker. And in a town like theirs, in a job like hers, that could mean ruin, loss of income, social ostracization. Maybe even worse if Sokolov found out she was onto him. The thought made her blood run cold. What would a spy do to someone who discovered their secret? The newspaper headlines about defectors and agents, once distant tragedies, now seemed to whisper directly into her ear. But ignoring it felt impossible. This wasn't just about her. This was about the factory, about the nation. The work they did there was vital. If Sokolov was a spy, he wasn't just observing. He was undoubtedly feeding information to America's enemies. And that Elsie knew was an act of treason. She couldn't stand by and let that happen. Her husband had died for this country. She owed it to his memory, to herself, to every honest worker in that plant to do something. But what? She had no proof, not really. Just a gut feeling and a fleeting glimpse in a dark alley. She needed more, something concrete, something undeniable. She decided she had to document everything. Every strange look, every unusual routine, every whispered conversation. The next day, Elsie brought a small, worn notebook and a pencil to work. She kept it hidden in her lunchbox. During breaks in the restroom or whenever she found a moment of privacy, she jotted down her observations. Oct 14th saw Sokolov with unknown man in alley behind plant. Package exchanged. Dark suit. Midnight. Oct 15th, Sokolov observed new hydraulic system blueprints again. Spent 10 mins, not his department, unblinking stare. Oct 16th, noticed Sokolov always arrives 15 mins before shift, leaves 15 mins after. No chatter, just watching, always checking watch. Oct 18th, Sokolov's accent seemed stronger today when he mumbled about a faulty wire. Not American, not German, Russian. The notebook became her secret confidant, a heavy weight in her lunchbox, yet a strange comfort. It gave her a sense of purpose, of control, in a situation that felt increasingly out of control. Her fear hadn't lessened. It had sharpened, become focused. She felt a constant tension in her shoulders, a gnawing dread in her stomach. Every time Sokolov walked past her, she held her breath, convinced he could somehow sense her growing suspicions, hear the frantic scribbling of her pencil in her hidden notebook. There were moments, brief and terrifying, when their eyes would meet across the bustling factory floor. Elsie would quickly avert her gaze, pretending to be engrossed in her work, her heart thumping. Did he know? Was he watching her too? His expression, as always, gave nothing away. It was a blank mask, but now, to Elsie, it felt like a silent challenge. He was a predator, and she was, in her own small, determined way, stalking him. One afternoon, a new machine was being installed. It was a highly specialized piece of equipment, state-of-the-art, and required delicate handling. The installation crew was meticulous, taking measurements, making adjustments. Sokolov, predictably, was observing, but this time he wasn't just watching. Elsie saw him, in a moment when the foreman's back was turned, subtly reach out and touch a component of the machine, a small, unmarked piece on the underside. It was a fleeting gesture, almost imperceptible. He wasn't examining it, not really. It was more like he was committing its shape, its texture, its very presence to memory. a physical imprint. He withdrew his hand just as quickly, his face returning to its usual neutrality. Elsie's breath hitched. That wasn't curiosity, that was reconnaissance. She scribbled it down in her notebook during her next break, her hand trembling slightly. This wasn't just observing blueprints. This was physical access. This was HANDS when intelligence gathering. The stakes, already high, had just skyrocketed. Elsie's life outside the factory was also impacted. She stopped going to the movies with Betty. She declined invitations to church socials. She spent her evenings poring over her notes, cross-referencing, trying to find patterns, trying to make sense of the overwhelming puzzle. She bought a newspaper every day, devouring articles about espionage, about defectors, about the latest Cold War tensions. She was educating herself, building a mental dossier on the enemy. The isolation was immense. She couldn't share her burden, and the weight of it was crushing. She was a single woman, a factory worker, up against a potentially ruthless, trained operative. It felt absurd. But the conviction was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, tightening with every new observation. The choice was clear. She couldn't keep this to herself. She couldn't ignore it. The longer Sokolov stayed, the more damage he could do. She had to ACT. She had to find someone who would believe her, someone who could actually do something. It was a terrifying prospect. She might lose everything, her job, her home, her reputation. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. The next morning, Elsie woke with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a burning sense of duty. She couldn't let this go, not after what she'd seen, not after what her husband had fought for. She needed to tell someone official, someone who would understand the gravity of her observations. Her first thought was the local police. They handled crime, didn't they? Espionage felt like a crime. After her shift, heart-pounding, she took the bus downtown, the worn notebook clutched in her purse. The police station was a drab, functional building, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. A bored-looking desk sergeant, his uniform straining at the seams, looked up as she approached. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone indicating he doubted she could be. Elsie took a deep breath. "Yes, I need to report something very serious." She started her story, trying to keep it calm, factual, pulling out her notebook. She described Sokolov, his odd behavior, the blueprints, the alley meeting. As she spoke, she watched the sergeant's face. It started with polite indifference, shifted to a flicker of amusement, and then settled into a weary, paternalistic patience. "Now, Mrs. Peterson," he interrupted gently, holding up a hand. "I appreciate you coming in. The Cold War's got everyone a bit on edge, I know, but a Soviet spy in our factory, that's quite a claim." He gestured dismissively at her notebook. "These are just observations, ma'am. A man being quiet, looking at blueprints, meeting someone in an alley. None of that is illegal. People have their own lives." "But he's a spy," Elsie insisted, her voice rising slightly. "He's gathering information for the Soviets. I saw him touching the new hydraulic machine, the classified one." The sergeant sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mrs. Peterson, do you have any proof, any actual evidence? A confession, a coded message, or just feelings about this fellow?" Elsie fumbled for words. "My observations are proof. He's too perfect, too quiet, he doesn't fit in. And that man in the alley—" "Look," the sergeant said, cutting her off, his voice hardening slightly. "The FBI handles national security matters. This is way above our pay grade. And frankly, with all due respect, ma'am, you sound a bit agitated. I recommend you go home, get some rest. Maybe talk to a doctor if these thoughts are bothering you." He handed her a slip of paper with a generic FBI field office number in a neighboring city. It was a clear dismissal. She was just another paranoid citizen, another woman letting the headlines get to her. Elsie walked out, the anger and frustration a bitter taste in her mouth. She hadn't even scratched the surface. The FBI. That was the next step. It took her a few days to work up the courage again, to call, to explain to a series of increasingly skeptical voices over the phone. Each conversation was a variation of the same theme: polite disbelief, thinly veiled condescension. She was directed from one department to another, each time having to retell her story, her voice growing hoarse, her resolve slowly chipping away. Finally, she was told to come in for an interview not at a bustling field office, but at a small, nondescript government building on the edge of town, one she hadn't even known existed. This felt different. Maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. She met with a man named Agent Davis. He was young, clean-cut, with an air of clinical detachment. He listened patiently, taking notes on a pad, never interrupting. Elsie detailed everything, from Sokolov's arrival to the alley meeting to his unusual precision to the touching of the classified machinery. She presented her notebook, its pages filled with her meticulous, if amateur, observations. When she finished, Agent Davis placed his pen down, steepled his fingers, and looked at her with an unblinking gaze. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice level, "I understand your concern. The threat of Soviet espionage is very real. However, what you've presented here are circumstantial observations. A man who's quiet, a man who works hard, a man who keeps to himself. These are not, in themselves, evidence of espionage." Elsie felt a hot flush of anger. What about the blueprints? What about the alley meeting? What about him touching the new machine? "We get tips like this all the time, Mrs. Peterson," Agent Davis replied, his tone chillingly calm. "After the war, with all the shifting populations, people are often suspicious of those who are different. And the Cold War rhetoric only exacerbates it. We have to be careful not to create panic or unjustly accuse innocent people." He paused. "Do you have any direct evidence? Any photographs, recordings, anything from Sokolov himself admitting to anything?" Elsie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I know. I feel it in my bones. He's not who he says he is." Agent Davis gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Mrs. Peterson, we operate on facts, not feelings. Your claims, while concerning, lack the specific, verifiable evidence we would need to initiate a full investigation, let alone surveillance. It could jeopardize our resources, compromise genuine investigations, and, frankly, ruin an innocent man's life." He closed her notebook, handed it back to her. "I appreciate you coming forward. Your patriotism is commendable, but we advise you to simply observe. If anything truly concrete emerges, something undeniable, then you can contact us again. Otherwise, please, do not spread these rumors. It could cause unnecessary trouble in your workplace." Dismissed again. Worse, she was WARNED. The message was clear. She was a nuisance, not a whistleblower. She was a potential source of unnecessary trouble. She left the office feeling deflated, defeated, and more isolated than ever. The system, it seemed, was designed to protect itself, not to listen to ordinary people who dared to see extraordinary things. The irony was bitter. The very Cold War paranoia that fueled her suspicion was now being used to dismiss her. Elsie went back to her routine, but it was a hollow performance. The weight of her secret, coupled with the crushing dismissal from the authorities, felt unbearable. She continued her quiet observations, filling pages in her notebook, but without hope. They felt like meaningless scribbles. The sense of urgency, however, never faded. She knew deep down that Sokolov was a threat. She couldn't let it go. Then a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the bureaucratic wall she kept hitting. One afternoon, a new security guard started at the plant. Not a young recruit, but an older man, a retired military veteran named Frank. He'd seen action in the Pacific and had the weariness of a man who'd witnessed too much. Frank was quiet but observant, his eyes missing nothing. Elsie, still reeling from her FBI encounter, avoided eye contact with all security personnel, afraid of being seen as trouble. But Frank was different. He sometimes lingered during her breaks, not talking but just being there. One day, he saw Elsie quickly stash her notebook as Sokolov walked by. He didn't say anything, but a thoughtful expression crossed his face. Later that week, Elsie noticed him watching Sokolov too, with an unusual intensity. Not the casual glance of a guard, but a sustained, almost analytical scrutiny. Emboldened by a desperate hope, Elsie decided to take another chance. It was a long shot, but what else did she have? During her lunch break, she approached Frank, her heart in her throat. "Mr. Jenkins." She began, using his last name. He turned, his eyes surprisingly kind, meeting hers. "Just Frank, ma'am." "You need something." I don't know if you've noticed anything about the new man, Sokolov," Elsie began cautiously, carefully choosing her words. "But I have some concerns." She didn't mention the FBI or her previous attempts. She just laid out her observations, much as she had before, but this time with a greater emphasis on what Sokolov did, not just how she felt. She talked about the specific blueprint, the precise measurements, the physical interaction with the new machinery. Frank listened, his gaze steady, his face unreadable. He didn't interrupt, he didn't scoff. When she finished, he simply nodded slowly. "I've noticed him," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Doesn't fit, does he? Too slick for the grunt work. Too observant for a man who's supposed to be just a bolt-turner." Elsie felt a surge of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. Someone saw it, someone else. "You see it too." Frank leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I was in intelligence during the war, Mrs. Peterson. Had to learn to spot the ones who didn't belong, the ones who looked like us but weren't. Sokolov, he's got the look of a man who's always got a plan B, always got an exit strategy." He paused. "You said he was looking at the new hydraulic system plans." "Yes, and he touched a component of it, a small, unmarked part on the underside. He seemed to be memorizing it." Frank's eyes narrowed. "That system, it's a critical component for our new missile guidance platforms. Top secret. The blueprints shouldn't even be accessible to line workers." But they were. Elsie countered, relief washing over her. "In the library, out in the open." Frank nodded, a grim expression on his face. "That's a security breach already, a big one." He then looked directly at Elsie. "You've been to the FBI, haven't you? They sent you away." It wasn't a question, Elsie flinched. "How did you know?" "They always do," Frank said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "Unless you walk in with a smoking gun, they'll tell you you're seeing shadows, especially if you're a woman, no offense. They're looking for cloak and dagger, not quiet observation from the factory floor." He paused, then added, "But I know a man who might listen. A good man. Used to be my co in the OSS. He's retired now, but he still has connections, and he trusts my judgment." This was it, a real lead. Not an agency gatekeeper, but a man who understood. A man who had been in the shadows himself. Elsie met Frank's contact, Mr. Davies, no relation to the dismissive Agent Davis, a week later. He was an older gentleman, sharp-eyed, with a kind but penetrating gaze. He listened to Elsie's story, this time with Frank corroborating her observations of Sokolov. Elsie brought her expanded notebook, now filled with even more details. Sokolov's precise, almost photographic memory for schematics, his lack of personal effects, the way he always seemed to be in the right place at the right time to observe sensitive operations. Mr. Davies, unlike the others, didn't dismiss her. He absorbed every detail, asking pointed questions. "You saw him touch the hydraulic component. Can you describe it exactly? Its location, its approximate size?" Elsie described it with painstaking detail, drawing a rough sketch in her notebook. Mr. Davies studied it, his brow furrowed in thought. "That part, it's proprietary. No markings. It's part of an experimental magnetic bearing system, very sensitive, very new." He then leaned forward, his voice serious. "Mrs. Peterson, your observations are compelling, more so because you've approached this with such precision despite the dismissals you've faced. This isn't hysteria. This is diligent observation. Frank confirms his instincts about the man, and your details about the new hydraulic system are particularly alarming." Elsie felt a surge of validation, of hope. Finally. "However," Mr. Davies continued, his voice softening, "we still need more. We need something undeniable, something that links him directly to an adversarial power, something that proves he's not just an odd but innocent man." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "And to get that, we're going to need your help, Mrs. Peterson. You are the only one close enough to him, the only one he doesn't suspect. You are our eyes and ears inside that factory." Elsie's heart sank even as it swelled with a strange sense of purpose. Her help, that meant more risk, more danger. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Davies gave a faint, almost regretful smile. "You need to get closer. You need to look for specific things, communications, anything that seems out of place, anything that could be a dead drop, anything that could be a hidden compartment. And most importantly, we need to know how he's getting information out of that plant. But you cannot, under any circumstances, let him know you're onto him. Do you understand? Your life and the security of this country may depend on it." Elsie's life became a tightly wound coil of tension. Every morning, strapping on her work boots felt like preparing for battle. The factory, once a familiar comfort, transformed into a battlefield of wits. She was no longer just an observer. She was an operative, an amateur spy in the heart of enemy territory. And the enemy was working 5 feet away. Mr. Davies had given her specific instructions. Look for patterns. Does Sokolov ever make calls? Does he receive mail outside of the usual channels? Does he frequent any particular location in the plant that seems out of place? And most critically, they wanted to know how he communicated. Could he be using a drop point, a coded message? The fear was constant, a low thrum beneath her skin. She had to act naturally, had to avoid eye contact, had to pretend that the blank man was just another quiet worker. But inside her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, strategies, and constant vigilance. She started small. During breaks, instead of eating with Betty, she'd wander. She'd go to the furthest reaches of the plant, observing from a distance. She noticed Sokolov would often spend his lunch break in the break room. But instead of eating, he'd often simply sit, watching the clock, sometimes with a peculiar, almost imperceptible flick of his gaze towards the small, rarely used bulletin board near the back exit. The bulletin board was mostly covered with faded notices about lost tools and carpools, nothing of interest, or so it seemed. Elsie started to pay closer attention. She noticed that sometimes a new, slightly crumpled piece of paper, a seemingly innocuous note, would appear on the board. A notice about a fictional fishing club meeting or a community picnic. Then, a day or two later, it would be gone, and a new, equally unassuming note would replace it. It was subtle. Too subtle for anyone to notice unless they were looking. Elsie recognized the pattern. Dead drop. She couldn't touch them, couldn't take them. That would compromise everything. She had to observe, to document. She started writing down the exact phrasing of these notes in her notebook, noting the date and time they appeared and disappeared. It felt like playing a dangerous game of I Spy, where the stakes were terrifyingly real. The tension escalated one day when a new batch of raw materials arrived, destined for the classified hydraulic system. These were highly sensitive components, and their handling was restricted. Elsie, following Mr. Davies' instructions, paid close attention to Sokolov. He was on the other side of the floor, but his eyes, Elsie noticed, were constantly tracking the crates as they were moved. He wasn't just watching their movement, he seemed to be counting them, taking inventory. Later, during a brief lull, Elsie saw her chance. Sokolov had gone to the restroom. She quickly moved to his workstation. Her heart hammered. She knew this was dangerous. She risked everything. Her instructions were clear: observe, not interfere. But she felt an overwhelming urge to find something, anything concrete. His toolbox, neatly organized, every wrench, every screwdriver in its place. Too neat. She carefully, almost imperceptibly, slid open the drawer. Nothing but tools. But then, tucked beneath a false bottom, a thin, almost invisible layer of wood, she saw it. Not a weapon, not a radio. It was a tiny, intricately crafted piece of photographic film, no bigger than a postage stamp. Microfilm. Her fingers trembled as she carefully, painstakingly lifted it. It was clearly a photograph of a blueprint, a section of the hydraulic system, precisely what she had feared. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the undeniable proof. Just as she was about to replace it, a shadow fell over her. Lost something, Mrs. Peterson. Elsie froze, Sokolov. His voice for the first time held a distinct edge, cold, flat, dangerous. She turned slowly, the microfilm clutched in her hand, hidden from his view. His face was, as always, impassive, but his eyes were different. They were no longer blank. They were alert, aware. They had a chilling intelligence that sent a shiver down her spine. He knew. She forced a weak smile. Just looking for a wrench, Mr. Sokolov. Mine went missing. It was a clumsy lie. His gaze dropped to her hands, hidden behind her back. He didn't say anything. He just watched her, his silence more terrifying than any accusation. The air crackled with unspoken knowledge. He knew she was lying. He knew she was looking for something. He knew she was onto him. Then he did something utterly unexpected. He reached into his own toolbox, pulled out a wrench, and held it out to her. Here, take mine. His voice was unnervingly calm. Elsie's hand trembled as she took the wrench. Their fingers brushed. His were cold, firm. The microfilm was still hidden in her other hand. She managed a mumbled thank you and retreated, her legs feeling like jelly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wrench felt like a block of ice in Elsie's hand. She turned from Sokolov, forcing herself to walk away, to go back to her station, to pretend that nothing had happened. Her heart was a frantic drum solo against her ribs. Her mouth was dry. She could feel the microfilm, a tiny hard rectangle pressing against her skin, a precious, dangerous secret. She wanted to bolt, to scream, to just run out of the factory doors and never look back. But she couldn't. Not yet. She had to act normal. Every nerve ending screamed in protest, but her years of practical, disciplined work kicked in. She picked up a bolt, placed it in the machine, tightened it. Her movements were stiff, jerky, but she forced them to be deliberate. She could feel his eyes on her. Not a direct stare, not openly hostile, but a presence. A weight. She could almost feel the gears turning in his mind, calculating her next move, assessing her threat. The rest of the shift stretched into an eternity. Each clanging sound, each sudden movement from a coworker made her jump. She imagined him following her, watching her, waiting for the perfect moment. She kept her back mostly to him, but her peripheral vision was hyper-alert, registering every flicker of movement in his direction. He continued to work, as precise and methodical as ever, but now, to Elsie, every movement seemed infused with a sinister intent. How would she get the microfilm out? She couldn't just walk to the exit. What if he tried to stop her? What if he had accomplices? The thought made her dizzy. Mr. Davies had emphasized secrecy. No one was supposed to know. She was supposed to be a ghost. But now the real ghost knew she existed. The final whistle blew, a sound that usually brought relief, but today it was a signal of heightened anxiety. The rush of workers heading for the exits felt less like freedom and more like a stampede where she could easily be lost, or worse, isolated. Elsie moved with the flow, keeping her head down. She avoided the usual route to the locker rooms, opting instead for a longer, more circuitous path, hoping to shake any potential tail. She reached her locker, her hands fumbling with the combination. The small, dim space felt suffocating. She quickly changed, pulling on her worn coat, making sure the microfilm remained securely tucked away. She avoided looking at anyone, afraid her fear would be visible, an open book. As she stepped out of the locker room, she scanned the area. He wasn't there, a small breath of relief. But then, as she neared the main exit, she saw him, Sokolov. He was standing by the time clock, ostensibly waiting to punch out, but his gaze was fixed on the exit, on the stream of departing workers. And as Elsie approached, his eyes met hers. For a long, agonizing second, time seemed to stop. His face remained impassive, but his eyes, they burned with an unsettling intensity. A challenge, a promise. He didn't make a move, didn't say a word, but the message was clear. I see you. Elsie forced herself to walk past him, her head held high, though her legs felt like rubber. She punched out, her hands shaking slightly, and walked towards the doors. The cold evening air hit her face, a jolt of reality. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She walked towards the bus stop, but her gut screamed at her. Don't go home. Don't go home. He knew where she lived. He knew her routine. She couldn't risk it. She needed to get to Mr. Davies. Now, instead of the usual bus, she hailed a passing taxi, a rare indulgence. Drive, please, she said, her voice raspy. Just drive for a bit. And then the address I gave you last time, Mr. Davies' house. The ride was a blur of heightened senses. Every car that passed, every shadow on the street felt like a potential threat. She constantly checked the rearview mirror, her eyes scanning for a familiar, gaunt figure or any car that seemed to follow too closely. Her imagination ran wild, conjuring images of dark alleys, sudden grabs, the microfilm ripped from her grasp. She gripped her purse, knuckles white. The fear was a physical presence in the small taxi, a cold hand on her throat. Finally, the taxi pulled up to Mr. Davies' unassuming house. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She paid the driver, practically stumbled up the porch steps, and hammered on the door. Mr. Davies opened it, his expression changing from surprise to concern as he saw Elsie's ashen face, her disheveled hair, her trembling hands. "Mrs. Peterson." "What's happened?" he asked, pulling her inside. Elsie could barely speak. She fumbled for the microfilm, pulling it from its hiding place, tears of fear and relief streaming down her face. He knows, Mr. Davies. He knows I found it. I saw him. He knows." "Mr." Davies took the tiny film, his expression grim as he examined it. He then led her to a chair, gently telling her to breathe. "It's all right, Mrs. Peterson. You did it. You are safe now. Tell me everything." As she recounted the terrifying encounter, the shared glance, the silent communication, Mr. Davies' face grew harder. "This changes things," he stated, his voice low and serious. "His cover is blown, yes, but now you are in immediate danger. We need to ACT quickly." Mr. Davies wasted no time. The moment Elsie finished her harrowing account, he was on the phone, his voice sharp and urgent. He spoke in clipped tones, using codes and names Elsie didn't recognize. The room, which had seemed so safe a moment ago, was now humming with the unseen machinery of national security. Elsie sat, clutching a mug of warm tea, listening to her life transform with every word he uttered. He confirmed that the microfilm was indeed an exact reproduction of the critical section of the hydraulic system blueprints, the magnetic bearing component. Its precision, he explained, suggested a sophisticated camera, probably custom-made, small enough to be concealed easily. This wasn't just an amateur operating. This was a professional, a highly trained operative. "They're mobilizing," Mr. Davies said, hanging up the phone, his face grim. "The FBI military intelligence. They're converging on the factory. They understand the urgency now that he knows he's compromised. He'll try to bolt. Or worse, he'll try to silence you, Mrs. Peterson." Elsie felt a fresh wave of fear. "Silence me." "What?" "You're the loose end," he explained, his eyes softening slightly. "The one who saw too much, but don't worry, we won't let that happen. You'll be under protection starting tonight. But first, they need you to be there for the apprehension." "Me?" Elsie stammered. "Why me?" "You know his habits, his movements, his tells," Mr. Davies explained. "And more importantly, you're the one he'll be looking for. Your presence, even just within the factory gates, could be a distraction, a way to keep his focus diffused while they move in." He didn't mention that she was also a convenient witness to his capture, ensuring there would be no doubt. Elsie's stomach lurched, going back to the factory, to face him again. But she nodded. There was no backing out now. She had started this, she had to see it through. Her courage, born of duty and desperation, was all she had left. The next morning, Elsie was driven to the factory in an unmarked car. Two stern-faced agents were with her, one in the front, one beside her in the back. The factory gates, usually bustling, seemed quieter, heavier. There was an almost imperceptible tension in the air, a stillness beneath the usual industrial hum. She knew it wasn't just her imagination. The entire plant was under a silent siege. She was briefed inside a small, temporary command post set up in an unused office. Maps of the factory floor were spread out, marked with excess and arrows. Agents in plain clothes were everywhere, talking in low, urgent tones. The plan was precise. They would wait until a specific moment, just before the lunch break, when Sokolov would be relatively isolated near his station, and the movement of workers would provide cover for their approach. They had a team ready to cut off all exits. Elsie was given a specific task: return to her station, act as normally as possible. If she saw Sokolov make any unusual moves, any attempt to access a hidden compartment or signal someone, she was to subtly tap her foot twice. They had hidden cameras, but her eyes were still their most crucial tool. Walking onto the factory floor felt like entering a lioness den. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking figure, every machine a potential trap. She could see agents disguised as workers, maintenance crew, even delivery men scattered throughout the plant. Their eyes, though seemingly casual, scanned every corner, every face. Elsie made her way to her station, her hands clammy. She glanced at Sokolov's spot. He was there, working, his movements as fluid and precise as ever. If he was aware of the net closing in, he showed absolutely no sign. He was a perfect mask. The next hour crawled by. Elsie worked, her mind a frantic mix of fear and hyper-awareness. She kept stealing glances at Sokolov. He was still, unflappable. It was almost unnerving. She felt like she was watching a play and she was the only one who knew the tragic ending. Then it happened. A crane operator, one of the undercover agents, feigned a massive mechanical failure. A grinding halt, a shower of sparks, a loud, controlled shriek of metal. It drew everyone's attention, a diversion perfectly timed. All eyes turned to the spectacle. In that split second of mass distraction, two men dressed as factory supervisors moved in on Sokolov. They were fast, silent, like wraiths. One grabbed his arms, pinning them behind him, the other clamped a hand over his mouth before he could make a sound. It was over before anyone else even realized what was happening. No struggle, no shouts, just a swift, brutal efficiency. Elsie saw it all. Sokolov's eyes, as they locked onto hers for a fraction of a second during his capture, held no surprise, no panic. Only a profound, chilling resignation. It was as if he had been expecting it, as if he had known since that moment with the wrench that his game was up. And in that same glance, Elsie saw a flicker of something else, not anger, but a cold, distant acknowledgement, a validation. He knew she had won. He was quickly, almost surgically, escorted out through a discreet side door, hustled into an unmarked van that sped away. The entire operation took less than 30 seconds. By the time the rest of the factory workers turned back from the crane malfunction, Sokolov was gone, vanished, just as he had arrived, a ghost. The foreman, George, looked around, bewildered. Where'd Sokolov go? Anyone see Sokolov? Betty shrugged. Probably stepped out for a smoke. He's always disappearing. The factory floor buzzed with confusion for the rest of the day. Rumors flew. Sokolov had quit, he'd been fired, he'd been transferred, he'd won the lottery. No one could fathom the real truth. Elsie, meanwhile, was taken to a secure location for debriefing. It stretched for hours, then days. She recounted every detail, every suspicion, every observation, her notebook laid open as testament to her unwavering vigilance. The revelations about Nikolai Sokolov were staggering. He wasn't Russian, not directly. He was a highly trained operative from East Germany, recruited and groomed by the KGB, a master of deception. His real name was Klaus Richter. He had been infiltrated into the U.S. years prior, working in various industrial settings, slowly climbing the ladder, gathering intelligence on critical American technological advancements. The transfer from Detroit was a fabrication. He had been specifically assigned to Elsie's factory when intelligence indicated its role in the new missile guidance systems. His quiet demeanor wasn't shyness. It was a practiced discipline, a way to avoid drawing attention while absorbing every detail. His flawless work was a cover, a way to earn trust and unrestricted access. The microfilm was just the latest piece of a larger puzzle he was assembling, feeding vital information back to Moscow. The dead drop notes on the bulletin board were confirmed to be part of a sophisticated encrypted messaging system. The man in the alley, a low-level contact, also apprehended. Elsie's observations, initially dismissed as paranoia, were now lauded as extraordinary. You, Mrs. Peterson, a high-ranking intelligence officer told her, did what seasoned agents often fail to do. You saw past the facade. You trusted your instincts. You saved us years of research, potentially billions of dollars and perhaps even lives. The validation was immense, but it came with a heavy cost. The quiet, comfortable world Elsie had built for herself was shattered. The factory, once a place of honest labor and community, was now a symbol of infiltration, a reminder of the insidious threat that could hide anywhere. She learned that the plant's security was completely overhauled, new procedures put in place, the classified project moved to a more secure location. When Elsie finally returned to the factory, a week later, things were different. The atmosphere was somber. The rumors about Sokolov had died down, replaced by an unsettling silence. No one knew the truth, but everyone felt the void he left, a chilling reminder of the unknown. Her coworkers treated her differently. Betty looked at her with a confused, almost suspicious gaze. George, the foreman, avoided her eyes. She was no longer just Elsie. She was the woman who had gotten the quiet man next to her to disappear, and that made her in their eyes almost as mysterious as he had been. Elsie never truly went back to her old self. The world seemed sharper, more dangerous. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, read between lines where others saw only print. Her instincts, once just a survival tool, were now honed to a razor's edge. She had looked into the abyss of Cold War espionage, and it had looked back at her. The trust she had placed in institutions, in the inherent goodness of people, was shaken. She received a quiet commendation, a small, discreet pension increase, and a promise of continued protection. But the true reward, she realized, was the knowledge that she had stood firm. She had listened to her gut when everyone else turned a deaf ear. She had protected her country, her factory, and the memory of her husband's sacrifice. She was no longer just a factory worker. She was a silent guardian. Years later, Elsie would tell her story to a chosen few, a chilling tale of an ordinary woman who, by simply paying attention, stumbled upon an extraordinary truth. She knew the names of the agents, the code words, the intricacies of the network that Klaus Richter, the man she knew as Nikolai Sokolov, was part of. She knew the human cost of the Cold War, not just on battlefields, but on factory floors, in quiet homes, in the hearts of ordinary people forced to become heroes. Her life was never again defined by the rhythmic clang of the assembly line alone. It was also defined by the echoing silence of a spy who vanished, and the unwavering courage of a woman who dared to make him visible. She was a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest threats aren't found in uniforms or on battlefields, but in the quiet, unassuming shadows of everyday life, and that the greatest heroes are often those who simply refuse to look away. Elsie Mae Peterson, the American factory worker who caught her Soviet spy, became a silent legend, a living proof that even in the darkest corners of deception, the human spirit, with its innate sense of justice and keen observation, can shine a light on the truth. The enduring significance of Elsie Mae Peterson's story, though set in the distinct historical context of the Cold War, resonates powerfully with our contemporary reality. It serves as a potent reminder that the most dangerous threats often operate not in plain sight, but within the subtle, overlooked corners of our everyday lives. In an era saturated with information, where the lines between truth and deception are constantly blurred, Elsie's unwavering commitment to her instincts, despite widespread dismissal, stands as a testament to the crucial role of individual vigilance and critical thinking. We, too, live in a world grappling with silent wars, cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, economic espionage, and foreign interference, where the enemy is rarely a uniformed soldier but a hidden actor manipulating systems, exploiting vulnerabilities, or subtly influencing public perception. Elsie's character embodies the quiet heroism of ordinary citizens. Her skepticism of the too perfect, Nikolai Sokolov mirrors the healthy skepticism required today to navigate a landscape rife with sophisticated scams, deepfakes, and carefully constructed narratives designed to mislead. Just as Sokolov used his unassuming persona to blend into the factory, modern adversaries exploit the perceived normalcy of online platforms or supply chains to infiltrate, extract, or disrupt. The subtle tells Elsie observed, the unusual precision, the lack of personal history, the analytical gaze, are analogous to the digital breadcrumbs or behavioral anomalies that, if noticed, can expose sophisticated cybercriminals or agents of influence. The script underscores that genuine security isn't solely the domain of intelligence agencies. It's also a collective responsibility, beginning with individuals who dare to question and observe. Furthermore, the script highlights the pervasive challenge of bureaucratic inertia and the high cost of truth-telling. Elsie's initial frustrations with the police and FBI, who dismissed her concerns as paranoia or lack of hard evidence, are strikingly similar to the experiences of modern whistleblowers or experts whose early warnings about emerging threats, from pandemics to cybersecurity vulnerabilities, are often met with skepticism or outright denial until the crisis is undeniable. The psychological and professional toll on Elsie, facing ostracization and the fear for her life, reflects the real-world sacrifices made by those who choose to expose uncomfortable truths. Ultimately, Elsie's story is a compelling narrative about the fragility of peace and the constant, often invisible, struggle to preserve it. It teaches us that our comfort and security are built on vigilance, not complacency. The ghost in the machine may change its form from a Soviet spy in a factory to a foreign hacker in a network, or a disinformation agent on social media, but the fundamental lesson remains: paying close attention to the details, trusting our informed instincts, and having the courage to speak up, even when it's inconvenient or unpopular, is paramount to safeguarding the fabric of our society in an ever-complex and interconnected world. Elsie's journey from ordinary worker to accidental hero is a testament to the courage hidden within everyday Americans during the Cold War. But she wasn't the only one. If you're fascinated by these untold stories of ordinary citizens who played pivotal roles in uncovering deep-seated secrets, you absolutely have to watch our next deep dive.